into the earth. That's about 2/3 of a mile. And the combination shaft was a joint mining effort between 4 mining companies on the Comstock. In their wisdom, they thought a main vein of ore existed directly under that spot, and if they sunk that mine shaft, they'd all become very rich. But there was a couple problems. The first problem was once that shaft reached the 1,600-foot level, the shaft and all the tunnels connected to it flooded with highly mineralized hot groundwater coming into those tunnels at 190 degrees Fahrenheit. That scalded many of the miners. They installed 4 massive Cornish pumps and removed up to 5 million gallons of water each day just to keep mining. But folks, that wasn't the worst problem. The worst problem, there was no main vein of ore. That shaft only brought up some very low-grade ore. It was eventually declared a $7 million financial disaster. One of the few mines on the Comstock that never made 1 penny of profit. Now, folks, we're about to pass underneath a 160-year-old ore trestle. Now, this is how ore was brought from mines that were on the west side of the rails over to that crusher mill on the east side. Now, as we go underneath this trestle, I'd like you folks to take a look at those large rocks laying on the ground underneath it. Those large rocks laying there are actual gold and silver ore that has laid on the ground a century and a half. Now, the reason these rocks are on the ground is when they brought the ore across this trestle, if a rock was too big to go through that crusher machinery, well, they just pushed it at the top of the trestle. So if any of you folks are feeling a little bit lucky today, come on back later with a great big hammer. You can go to work on one of those rocks and you might just strike your fortune. It's a bit luckier than one of those slot machines. Now, when mining began on the Comstock Lode around 1860, the only way to get the ore down to the mills on the Carson River was by wagon and mule. It was very expensive, and it took up to a week for a wagon load of ore to make it down the mountains. In 1869, a man named William Sharon on the board of directors of the Bank of California thought it would be profitable for that bank to build a railroad between Carson City and Virginia City. Construction began in February 1869 with 1,500 workers employed to build the line. Coming the 21 miles from Carson City to Virginia City, 7 tunnels were dug through the Washoe Mountains, and the railroad comes up nearly 1,800 feet in altitude, making us one of America's true mountain railroads. Coming through those canyons, the railroad makes enough twists, turns, and curves that it equals 18 complete circles before arriving here in town. And folks, all those twists, turns, and curves gave us the nickname of being the crookedest railroad in the world. It took 11 months to build this railroad. The first passengers were unloaded in Virginia City in January 1870. We're going to be passing underneath the Highway 341 overpass. Now, at one time, this was tunnel number 5 of those 7 tunnels between Carson City and Virginia City. When that highway was built in 1932, they took the whole top off that mountain and did what's called daylight the tunnel. Now, folks, that did work out pretty well. If you'll take a look outside right now, you'll notice it's daylight out there right now. But there is something that we've always had a question about. As we go underneath this bridge, take a look at those great big steel columns beneath it. You folks might notice the same thing we did. Those great big steel columns, well, they don't even touch that bridge at all. Now, that might be something that we should be discussing with the highway department. But folks, I do believe that bridge was a government job. Now, once we go underneath this overpass and get on the other side of it, off the east side of the train, just over the rails, you'll see the remains of the Ward Bullion Shaft. Now, the Ward Bullion Shaft goes down 2,500 feet into the earth. The two owners of this shaft brought a fair amount of oil out of it, and they made some pretty good money off it. But like many mine owners during that period of time, those two fellows were a little bit greedy. They wanted more money. Imagine that. They started the rumor on the San Francisco Stock Exchange that the Ward Bullion Shaft was about to hit the big bonanza. Well, folks, in gold country in the early 1870s, when rumors like that started, investors came very quickly. In less than 3 weeks' time, more than $3.7 million was invested in stock in the Ward Bullion Shaft. And as soon as all that money cleared the San Francisco Stock Exchange and ended up as cash in those two fellas' pockets, well, folks, at that time, those two fellas just sat back and smiled and declared this shaft a bust and closed it. I bet don't feel too bad now for all those people that got swindled out of all their money investing in it. They all did get something. They all got the shaft. But folks, if you'll take a look down into one of our beautiful Nevada canyons, in the early morning hours, you often see a lot of the wildlife that roam here. We do have those herds of wild mustangs, and of course we're very proud of them. We also have a lot of coyote, mule deer, black-tailed deer, jackrabbits, cottontails. We've got the cutest mountain squirrel up this side of the Sierra Nevadas. We've got the red-tailed hawk, the California quail, and the bad boys of the desert as well, the Great Basin rattlesnake, some mountain lion, and some bobcat. And you folks might notice that there are no lumber-producing trees up here in the Washoe Mountains. Folks, we are in an area called high desert at over 6,200 feet in altitude. There's very little water up here to support that type of growth. All the lumber for the mines, mills, homes, and businesses came from the beautiful Sierra Nevada mountains. And most all of that lumber was brought here by the Virginia Truckee Railroad. The trees you do see growing here, the larger one is the pinyon. That's one of Nevada's state trees. The smaller, lighter colored tree is the mountain juniper. The bluff closest to us, you'll see the remains of the East Yellow Jacket mine. Now, the East Yellow Jacket mine was one of the highest producing mines on the Comstock Lode. It's also the site of the greatest disaster ever on the Comstock. In late 1869, a fire broke out at the 800-foot level in the East Yellow Jacket shaft. And folks, that fire took the lives of 39 miners. Now, eventually, they were able to recover 34 of those poor souls, but 5 of them were just simply never found. Now, that fire was sealed off in the portions of the shaft and the tunnels that it was burning in, but because of the air being pumped down into the mines for the miners, it continued to burn underground for 2.5 years. Now, folks, we're about to enter tunnel number 4. For those of you who might be afraid of the dark, when we go through the tunnel, please close your eyes. Tunnel number 4 is 456 feet long from end to end. It took those workers in 1869 2.5 months to dig this tunnel through solid rock using pick and shovel only. Now, those miners that worked on the Comstock Lode were a pretty tough bunch. They had a nickname at that time. They were called muckers, and that was a name of respect for them. They would work in those mines 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, in temperatures around 120 degrees at the lower levels. Now at those temperatures, they could only work about 15 minutes at a time. Then they would have to proceed upward in the main shaft and off the side of what was called a drift. At the end of that drift, they kept ice and cold water. They'd cool down a bit, then go back to work for about 15 minutes more. During that period of time, miners around the world made about 80 cents a day for their labor. Miners on the Comstock Lode were in such high demand, they became the highest paid miners in the world at $4 a day. Now folks, that's the equivalent of $66 per hour now. And at the end of their shift, folks, well, they could go to Virginia City. They could order a 2-inch thick steak weighing about 2 pounds and a great big plate of beans. And folks, that meal would cost them 40 cents. Now, coming around the next curve, we're going to be looking down into Gold Canyon over the town of Gold Hill. Coming into view down in the canyon, the large steel roof building you folks will see down there at one time was the Crown Point Mill. Now, the functions of the mills on the Comstock was to crush that ore rock into near dust. That dust would then be taken down to the processing plants on the Carson River, where the gold and silver would be extracted by the mercury or cyanide recovery process. Coming into view down the canyon, you folks will also see the Gold Hill Hotel and Saloon. Now, this is the oldest continually operating hotel in Nevada. It opened in 1859 as a tent saloon. The stone hotel portion that you folks will see up front was added 2 years later in 1861. Now, it's still in business today, just as it was in 1859. The original owners of that hotel are still dead. The brick front building with the 3 steel doors on the front of it at one time was the Bank of California. This area of Gold Hill was known as the Maynard Block, one of the cash and stock exchange areas along the Comstock Lode. There were days when up to $1 million would exchange hands in cash and mining stock right on that very street. Now, coming around the curve to the grade crossing, off the east side, you'll see the monument to the Liberty Volunteer Fire Company. These were the brave volunteer firefighters that protected Gold Hill from fires in the mines and the desert. Now, this monument is located right where the original fire hall once stood, just next to the railroad tracks. The original fire hall, well, it burned up in a fire. Now, just past the grade crossing is the 1869 section the Virginia Truckee Railroad built for the town of Gold Hill. Now, the T Railroad owned and operated this railroad station from 1869 until this line to Virginia City was abandoned in 1938. At that time, the railroad sold the station and all the property around it to Story County, Nevada, for the sum of $1. Now, folks, coming up to the rear of the train off the west side, on that little rise above us and to our rear, you'll see the remains of the North Yellow Jacket shaft. Now, a little bit about how it all worked, folks. That large tower up on the hill is called the head frame. That's what was used to hoist the ore up from the depths in large steel buckets. That ore would then be dumped down those two steep wooden chutes into what's called the ore bin at the bottom. Once this ore bin was sufficiently full, as we pass it, you'll see three doors on the front that would be open. That ore would then be dumped into railroad cars to be taken for crushing and processing. Now, folks, as the train does come to a stop here, something a little interesting off the east side. If you folks will look right over the bluff, you'll see the main head frame of the Yellow Jacket mining complex. Notice those huge wooden timbers have been plastered with concrete. Folks, that was done in an effort to help prevent that head frame from burning in the event of a fire. Now, folks, you might remember before we came to the tunnel, and on the other side of that mountain, I did point out to you over there, the East Yellow Jacket shaft. Right here off the west side, just above us, that's the North Yellow Jacket shaft. And just over the bluff, the main shaft of the Yellow Jacket complex. Well, folks, all three of these mine shafts are connected together underground on many different levels by over 40 miles of tunnels.